Max's paw sack dasher padded along the icy street, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Hunger gripped his stomach, but survival had taught them to focus one thing at a time tonight. This priority was finding a safe place to rest at. She turned into an alleyway. The dim glow of a street lamp illuminated a dumpster, overflowing with discarded food. Max cautiously approached, his nose twitching at the scent of half-eaten sandwiches and scraps. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him going for another day. Unbeknownst to Max, his scavenging had not gone unnoticed. An older man, Joe, bundled in a thick coat and scarf, watched the dog from the shadows of his small convenience store. Joe had lived in the town for decades and had seen his fair share of strays, but there was something different about Max. The dog moved with a cautious dignity, his eye scanning his surroundings, as if expecting danger at every corner. Joe had a soft spot for animals, especially those who had known hardship. Grabbing a leftover roast chicken from his store's counter, he stepped outside and called out softly, "Hey there, buddy, you hungry?" Max froze, his ink screaming at him to run, but the kind to Neen. Joe's voice was disarming. The dog turned his head slightly, his ears perked, and his tail gave the faint test of wags encouraged. Joe crouched down and placed the chicken on the ground, then backed away to give Max space slowly. Max approached, his nose quivering as she sniffed the food. Within moments she was devouring the meal, his eyes flicking up to Joe every few bites. Over the next few days, a tentative bond formed between the man and the dog. Joe began leaving food outside his shop at the same time each evening, and Max learned to trust the quiet, unassuming man who never made sudden movements or raised his voice. Though Max still refused to let anyone touch him, he started lingering longer after meals, sitting a few feet away, as Joe talked to him in a soothing voice. One evening, as Max finished his meal, he surprised both himself and Joe by taking a cautious step forward. Joe held his breath, resisting the urge to move. Max sniffed the air, his dark eyes meeting Joe's for a moment, then, as if testing the water, she pressed his nose against Joe's outstretched hand. It was a small gesture, but it marked a turning point in their relationship. Joe, a widower with no children, solace in Max's quiet companionship, he began setting up a small bed of blankets behind his shop. Hopping the dog would take shelter there during cold nights. Slowly but surely, Max began to accept Joe's care. For the first time in years, she experienced warmth, not just physical but emotional. Joe often wondered about Max's past. The dog's scars, both physical and emotional, told a story of hardship. But Joe respected his new companion in silence. He didn't push for affection or try to control him. Instead, he offered consistent kindness, allowing Max to heal at his own pace. As months passed, Max's fur grew shinier and his eyes regained some off their former brightness. He began accompanying Joe on his daily walks to the town's edge, where children playing in the snow would occasionally wave at the pair. Max still flinched at sudden movements, but his confidence was slowly returning. The bond between man and dog deepened, rooted in mutual trust and a shared understanding of loneliness. The uncrisp spring morning, something unusual happened as Joe and Max strolled along their usual route. Max stopped abruptly, his ears perked and his nose twitching. He stared down the road, his body tense. Joe followed the dog's gaze and saw a man walking toward the man who looked vaguely familiar. Max's tail, which had been wagging moments earlier, went trigital, grow rumbled in his throat, a sound Joe had never heard from him before. The man approaching them had a rough appearance, his clothes disheveled, and his eyes scanning the street nervously. Joe instinctively stepped closer to Max, placing a protective hand on his head. The man's eyes landed on Max and froze. Max called out instantly, his voice tinged with disbelief. Joe felt Max stiffen under his touch, and the dog's growl grew louder. Joe realized in an instant who this man must be, Max's former owner. The man took another step forward, his hand reaching out as if to grab the dog. But Max wasn't the same frightened animal who had fled 2 years ago. With a fierce bark, he lunged forward, placing himself between Joe and the stranger. The cold winter air cut through the desolate streets of a small rural town. As dusk began to settle among the shadows, a lone dog limped cautiously along the road, its fur matted and its eyes carrying a weight far beyond its ears. His name was Max, a scruffy mute who had endured more in his short life than most animals should ever have. To once a beloved pet, Max had known the warmth of family and the gentle touch of a caring hand. But those memories had faded, replaced by the haunting recollections of cruelty and neglect 2 years prior. Max's owner had been a man Ahmed Allen, whose once kind demeanor had turned bitter after losing his job. With nowhere to vent his frustrations, Allen's anger found a target in Max. The dog bore the brunt of Allen's outbursts, sending in harsh words, kicks, and even days without food. Max's once bright eyes grew dull and his wagging tail fell still, but despite the mistreatment, Max's spirit never broke entirely. Deep within him, a flicker of loyalty and love remained. One fateful night, after a particularly violent episode, Max found the courage to escape with nothing but the biting wind at this back hair and as fast as legs could carry him, leaving behind the only home he had ever known. For days, Max wandered aimlessly, Scavenging for scraps and sleeping under bridges, the scars on his body told a tale of pain. But the light in his eyes hinted at an unyielding hope. Little did Max know his journey was far from over. In Quistah fate, he would cross paths with a kind-hearted stranger who would change his life forever. But the most incredible chapter of his story was yet to come, a moment 2 years in the making that would shock everyone who doubted him. The police officers stepped into the shop, their flashlights cutting through the dim interior. Joe recounted the events, his voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through him. Max sat by his side, his eyes never leaving the door, as if expecting Alan to return. The officers assured Joe they would patrol the area and keep an eye out for Alan, but their words did little to ease his worry. After the officers left, Joe locked the door and knelt beside Max, stroking the dog's head. "It's over, buddy," he said softly, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. Max leaned into Joe's touch, his usual wariness replaced by a rare moment of vulnerability. The following morning, Joe decided it was time to take action. He called a friend who worked at an animal shelter in a nearby town. Karen was a seasoned advocate for animal welfare, and Joe knew she'd have advice on how to protect Max. After hearing the story, Karen didn't hesitate. "You need to get Max microchip and officially registered in your name," she said. "That way, if Alan tries anything, you'll have legal proof that Max belongs to you." Joe agreed and set up an appointment at the shelter. The process was straightforward, and Karen even offered to file a report documenting the encounter with Alan. As she scanned Max's microchip to activate it, a strange look crossed her face. "What is it?" Joe asked, his stomach tightening. Karen hesitated before answering. "Max already has a microchip. It was registered to someone 2 years ago, Alan Thompson." Joe felt a cold knot form in his chest. "What does that mean?" Hesked. "Does this give him a legal claim to Max?" Karen sighed. "Not necessarily. Ownership laws vary by state, and in cases of neglect or abuse, the courts almost always side with the current caregiver, especially if the animal is well cared for. But this complicates things. If Alan wanted to make a case, he could." Then news left Joe uneasy. Had worked so hard to give Max a safe and loving home, and the thought of Alan disrupting their lives was unbearable. But Karen's next words offered a glimmer of hope. "I'll contact a lawyer who specializes in animal custody cases," she said. "We make sure Max's history is documented. If it comes to a legal battle, we'll be ready." Feeling a mix of relief and apprehension, Joe thanked Karen and took Max home that evening. As they sat together by the fire, Joe couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of their troubles. Max, sensing Joe's unease, rested his head on Themon's lap. His soft eyes filled with trust. Days turned into weeks and life slowly returned to normal. Joe resumed his daily walks with Max, avoiding the area where they had encountered Alan. Max seemed to sense the shift's mood, staying closer to his city and reacting more alertly to their surroundings. Despite the tension, their bond continued to grow. The non-crisp morning, a letter arrived in Joe's mailbox. The envelope wasp lengths caught his attention. It was from a law firm. Joe's heart sank as she opened the letter and began to read it. It was a formal notice from Alan's lawyer, claiming that Max was Alan's property and demanding his return. The letter was filled with accusations, painting Alan a salmon who had lost this beloved dog due to a series of unfortunate circumstances. There was no mention of the abuse Max had suffered, no acknowledgement of the scars, both physical and emotional, that told the true story. Joe immediately called Karen, who wasn't surprised by the development. "This is exactly why we documented everything," she said. "Don't worry, Joe will fight this." The situation escalated quickly. Alan filed a legal complaint, and within days, Joe received a court summons. The thought of standing before a judge fighting for Max's future was daunting. But as Joe looked at the dog sleeping peacefully on the rug, he knew he had no choice. Max was more than a pet, it was family. Joe's at this kitchen table, the court summons in front of him. His mind's whirled with emotions, anger, fear, and determination. Across the room, Max lay curled up on his bed, unaware of the legal storm brewing around him. Joe ran a hand through his hair, taking a deep breath. "We're not going to lose this, Max," he said aloud, more to himself than the dog. "I won't let it happen." That evening, Joe met with Karen and the lawyer. She had recommended a sharp and empathetic attorney named Rachel Collins. Rachel had handled numerous cases involving animal custody and quickly assured Joe that they had a strong case. The courts prioritized the welfare of the animals. She explained, "If we can prove neglect or abuse, Alan won't stand a chance." Rachel outlined their strategy. They would present evidence of Max's improved health and well-being under Joe's care, as well as testimonies from witnesses who could speak to Alan's treatment of the dog. Karen had already gathered a list of neighbors and shelter workers who had encountered Max during his time. Asa remembered his fearful demeanor and visible scars. Over the next few weeks, Joe threw himself into preparing for the case. He compiled every photo he had taken of Max since adopting him, showing the dog's transformation from a malnourished, timid stray to a healthy and confident companion. Karen helped track down veterinary records documenting Max's injuries and recovery, which would serve as crucial evidence of his past mistreatment. Despite the mounting pressure, Joe tried to maintain a sense of normalcy for Max. They continued their daily walks, though Joe remained vigilant, always scanning the streets for any sign of Alan. Seemed to sense Joe's unease of Tin, pausing to nuzzle his hand or wagging his tail as if to say, "It's okay, we'll get through this." One evening, as Joe reviewed court documents in the living room, a knock at the door startled him. His heart raced as she approached, half expecting Alan to be standing on the other side. Instead, he found a young woman in her 20s shouldering a stack of papers. "Shire, you Joe Shesk, my name's Emily, I'm Alan's niece." Joe hesitated before nodding. "What do you want?" Emily glanced nervously at the ground before meeting Joe's gaze. "I heard about the case," she said, "and I wanted to help Alan. He's my uncle. But I know what he did to Max. He doesn't deserve to get him back." Joe's surprise quickly turned to caution. "Why are you telling me this? Hesked, why go against your own family?" Tears well up in Emily's eyes. "Because Max doesn't deserve to go back to that," she said. "I's who my uncle treated him. It tried to stop him, but Alan didn't listen. When Max ran away, I prayed he'd find a better life, and it looks like he did." Emily handed Joe the stack of papers. "These are statements from neighbors who witnessed the abuses," she explained, "and there's a video too. I don't know if it'll be enough, but I thought it might help." Joe's hands trembled as she took the papers. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This means more than you know." Emily smiled faintly. "Take care of him," she said before turning and walking away. That night, Joe and Rachel reviewed the new evidence. The video captured by a neighbor's security camera showed Alan dragging Max by the collar, yelling obscenities while the dog cowered in fear. Rachel's expression hardened as she watched. "This is exactly what we needed," she said. "It's undeniable proof of neglect." The court date arrived faster than Joe anticipated. As she and Rachel entered the courthouse, Joe felt a wave of anxiety which hovered him. He glanced down at Max, who sat obediently by his side, his leash held loosely in Joe's hand. "We've got this, buddy," he whispered, drawing strength from the dog's calm demeanor inside the courtroom. Alan sat with his lawyer, a stern-looking man in a sharp suit. Alan avoided Joe's gaze, his expression a mix of defiance and discomfort. The judge, an older woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, called the court to order and invited Rachel to present their case. Rachel spoke with conviction, outlining Max's journey from neglect to recovery under Joe's care. She presented the evidence, veterinary records, witness testimonies, and the video provided by Emily. Each piece painted a damning picture of Alan's treatment of the dog. When it was Alan's turn to speak, he tried to shift the blame, claiming that his actions were taken out of frustration and that he had always cared for Max. But this argument fell flat in the face of the overwhelming evidence against them. Even his own niece's testimony worked against him. As Emily took the stand to recount what she had witnessed, the judge listened intently, her expression give little away. When both sides had finished presenting their cases, she announced a short recess before delivering her verdict. Joe sat in the hallway with Max's heart pounding. He couldn't bear the thought of losing the dog who had become his family, but looked into Max's trusting eyes. He felt a surge of hope. No matter what happened, he knew he had done in his power to protect them. The courtroom was silent as everyone filed back and waiting for the judge to deliver her verdict. Joe's hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. Ma sat quietly at his feet, this calm demeanor a sharp contrast to the tension in the room. The judge adjusted her glasses, her expression firm but unreadable. In reviewing the evidence presented, she began, her voice steady. "It's clear that Alan Thompson exhibited patterns of neglect and abuse toward the animal in question. Max, the veterinary records, witness statements, and video evidence lead no doubt as to the conditions this dog endured. Therefore, I hereby rule that Miss Joseph Carter is the rightful and legal owner of Max. This court finds no basis for Miss Thompson's claim of custody relief." Flooded Joe's body as the words sank in, here H down to scratch Max behind the ears, whispering, "We did it, buddy." Across the room, Alan's face, twisted in anger, has stood abruptly, slamming his hands on the table. "This isn't over," has gnarled, pointing a finger at Joe. "You regret this." The judge, her gavel sharply. "Miss Thompson, I suggest you leave this courtroom quietly. Any further outbursts will result in contempt charges." Alan's lawyer placed a hand on his shoulder, urging him to sit, but Alan shrugged him off and stormed out of the room. The tension lingered even after he was gone. Rachel leaned over to Joe and said softly, "We've won this battle, but be careful. People like him don't always give up so easily." Joe nodded, his joy tempered by the lingering threat. The new Alan wouldn't let goof his grudges so easily. Over the next few days, Joe tried to return to a normal routine, and Max resumed their walks, this time venturing to new trails farther from town. The court ruling brought a sense of security, but Alan's parting words echoed in Joe's mind, keeping him munging evening. Joe noticed a strange car parked across the street from his shop. It Wasn't one here cognized, and the driver remained in. Watching the building, Joe's stomach churned. Was it Alan or perhaps someone working for him? He debated calling the police, but decided to wait and see if the car left on its own. As night fell, the car finally drove away, but the unease lingered. Joe shared his concerns with Karen, who immediately offered to contact the local police. They need to know about this. She insisted if Alan is harassing you, they can step in the police. Took Joe's report seriously, promising to patrol the area more frequently. Still, the situation weighed on him. He found himself double-checking the locks in his doors and looking over his shoulder whenever he left the shop. Meanwhile, Max seemed to sense Joe's anxiety. The dog had always been protective, but now his vigilance intensified. He barked at every unfamiliar sound and positioned himself near Joe whenever they were outside, though Max's behavior was comforting. Joe couldn't help but worry that their lives would never truly be free of Alan's shadow. One night, as Joe was closing up the shop, he heard a noise in the alley behind the building. It was faint at first, a shuffle of feet, a clatter of something metallic. Max growled low in his throat. His ears perked. Joe grabbed a flashlight and cautiously stepped outside. At his side, the beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing nothing at first. But then, just as Joe was about to turn back, he spotted a figure darting behind a dumpster. Who's there? He called out, his voice steady. Despite his pounding heart, the figure didn't respond, but Max lunged forward, barking furiously. Joe held tight to the leash, his grip firm. Show yourself, he demanded slowly. Age emerged from behind the dumpster, his hands raised. In surrender, he looked older than 16, his clothes dirty and his face pale. I wasn't doing anything, the boy stammered. Is where Joe lowered the flashlight slightly, but didn't let this guard down. What are you doing back here? The boy hesitated before muttering, I was just looking for food. Joe's initial suspicion softened the boy's gaunt frame and ragged appearance as spoke of hardship. Are you homeless? Joe asked gently. The boy nodded, his eyes darting nervously toward Max, who had stopped barking but remained alert. Joe sighed and gestured toward the shop. Come inside. I'll get you something to eat, as the boy followed him inside. Joe couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was more than a coincidence. Was the boy telling the truth, or had he been sent by Alan to spy on him? Either way, Joe decided to help prepare a plate of food and watched as the boy devoured it hungrily. Thank you, the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to scare you. Joe nodded but kept his questions to himself for now. We couldn't ignore the possibility that this boy's appearance was connected to the events of the past few weeks. The mystery only deepened, adding another layer of uncertainty to an already precarious situation. As the teenager finished his meal, Joe sat across from him, Max leaning protectively at his feet. The boy seemed nervous, avoiding Joe's gaze while fidgeting with the hem of his worn jacket. What's your name? What's your name? Joe asked gently, trying to put him at. Evan, the boy mumbled, glancing up briefly before returning his focus to the plate. Joe nodded. Well, Evan, you're safe here. Do you have anywhere to go, any family? Evan hesitated, his shoulders tensing. No, it's just me, head admitted, his voice barely audible. There was a weight in his words, a story he wasn't ready to share. Joe decided not to press further, though his curiosity was piqued. He couldn't shake the feeling that Evan's sudden appearance wasn't entirely random. After cleaning up, Joe offered Evan a place to sleep for the night, a small coat in the shop's back room. You be warm here, he said, handing the boy a blanket. We can figure things out tomorrow. Evan nodded, his gratitude apparent in the way he clutched the blanket. Max followed Joe back to the main area, his tail wagging slightly, as if he sensed the boy's vulnerability. Good boy, Joe murmured, scratching Max behind the ears. Keep an eye on him that night. Joe barely slept. His thoughts were a tangled mess of worry and suspicion. Was Evan truly just a homeless teenager in need, or was there more to his story? The strange car he noticed earlier came to mind, and a nagging voice in the back of his head whispered that Alan might still be pulling strings the following morning. Joe found Evan sitting cross-legged on the floor, Max leaning beside him. The dog's tail thumped happily against the wood. As Evan scratched behind his ears, it was a rare sight. Max, so cautious around strangers, seemed completely at ease. You're good with him? Joe said, breaking the silence. Evan smiled faintly. Ki good dog, he deserves to be treated right. The statement hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Joe decided it waste time for answers. Evan, why were you really in that alley last night? The boy's expression shifted, a flicker of guilt crossing his face. It told you, he said quickly. I was looking for food. Joe crossed his arms. And I believe you needed food. What? But there's more to it, isn't there? Hesitated, his eyes darting toward the door. Finally he sighed and said, okay, fine. I heard about you and Max. Some guys, they've been talking, saying Alan wants the dog back. I thought if I could, warn you, maybe you'd help me. Joe's heart sank. Alan sent, Evan's response was immediate, his voice sharp with panic. I'd never help him. He's a monster. I've seen what he's done to Max, to their dogs. That's why I left. I couldn't be part of it anymore. Joe stared at Evan. Trying to gauge the truth in his words, the boy eyes were earnest, filled with a mix of fear and determination. You worked with him, Joe asked quietly. Evan nodded, shame coloring his cheeks. Not by choice, my brother. He owed Alan money, a lot of money he couldn't pay. Alan made me work for him. I didn't have a choice. Joe felt a surge of anger, not at Evan, but Alan Themen's cruelty seemed to know no bounds. What did he make you do? Joe asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Anything he needed. Evan admitted, setting up fights, cleaning up after them, helping with the dogs. I hated it. It ried to leave, but Alan said he'd go after my brother if I did. Joe's chest tightened. And now I ran, Evan said. Simply, I couldn't take it anymore. But I think he's looking for me. That's why I was hiding in the alley. Joe leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. If Evan was telling the truth, he wasn't just a kid in trouble. He was a potential ally in the fight against Alan. You know where Alan keeps the dogs? Joe asked carefully. Evan nodded. Yeah, it's bad though, real bad. Joe exchanged a glance with Max, the dog's steady gaze giving him a strange sense of courage. Even if we're going to stop him, I need your help. The boy's eyes widened. Stop him, you mean turn him. Joe nodded with what, we can expose him, make sure he never hurts another dog or person again. Evan hesitated, his fear palpable. What if he finds out? What if he comes after me or you? Joe placed a reassuring hand on Evan's shoulder. We'll be careful, and we'll have the law on our side. Alan's time is running out. Evan took a deep breath, then nodded. Okay, I'll help, but you have to promise if anything happens, you'll look out for my brother. Joe nodded firmly. For you have my word. As the two began to plant their next steps, Max watched silently, his presence a steady reminder of why they were fighting. The stakes had just been raised, and the path ahead was fraught with danger. But for the first time, Joe felt like they had Ariel. Chancey justice. The decision to act against Alan marked a turning point over the next few days. Joe and Evan worked to piece together a plan. A boy's knowledge of Alan's operations was invaluable. He knew the location's routines and even some of the people involved in the dogfighting ring, despite their progress. Tension hung in the air like a storm cloud. Joe contacted Rachel, the lawyer who had helped him win. Of Maxon laid out the situation. She listened intently, her expression grim. If Evan is willing to testify, we can build a strong case against Alan, she said, but this is dangerous. Alan won't take this lying down. John nodded. We prepared for that. Just need to know we'll have legal support if things get messy. You will, Rachel assured him, but you need to gather solid evidence. Evan's testimony will help, but we'll need more documents, photos, anything that proves Alan's activities. Evans spoke up, his voice tentative. Alan keeps records at the warehouse. He's paranoid about his business and tracks everything. Dogs, fights, payouts. If we can get inside, we'll find what we need. Joe frowned. Breaking into his warehouse is risky. If we're caught, we won't be. Evan interrupted. I know the layout. I've been there 100 times, and with Max we might have an edge. Alan doesn't know you're planning this. Reluctantly, Joe agreed. They set a date for the operation, planning to move under the cover of night. Rachel promised to coordinate with local law enforcement, ensuring they would act swiftly once the evidence was secured. As the day approached, Joe couldn't shake a sense of foreboding. Alan's threats, the strange cur outside his shop, and now this bold plan. It all felt like they were walking a tightrope over a rapid of danger. Max seemed to sense his unease, staying close to his side and occasionally nudging him, as if to say, I've got your back. Finally, the K&N arrived. Joe and a van dressed in dark clothing, their movements deliberate and quiet. Max, his harness secure, stood alert by Joe's side. The trio slipped out of the shop and into the cool night air, heading toward the warehouse on the outskirts of town. The warehouse loomed large in the moonlight, its shadow stretching across the deserted lot. Evan led the way, pointing out the surveillance cameras and the best points of entry. The back door is usually unlocked. He whispered, but be careful, sometimes Alan leaves one of his guys here to watch the place. Joe nodded. Heart pounding, they moved silently toward the back of the building, Max padding softly beside them. The door creaked slightly as Joe pushed it open, the sound echoing in the stillness. Inside the warehouse was dimly lit rows of crates and cages, creating a maze of shadows. Evan motioned for Joe to follow us. He navigated the familiar layout. They reached a small office tucked away in the corner, its doors lightly ajar. Evan hesitated, then peeked inside. It's empty. He whispered, this is where he keeps the records. Joe stepped inside, quickly scanning the room. A metal filling cabinet sat against the wall, its drawers locked. Can you pick this? Hesked. Evan nodded, pulling a small set of tools from his pocket. As the boy worked, Joe kept watch, his ears straining for any sound of movement. Max stood by the door, his eyes fixed on the hallway. Beyond minutes felt like hours, but finally Evan let a triumphant whisper, got it. He opened the drawer, revealing a trove of documents and ledgers. Joe grabbed his phone and began snapping pictures, focusing on anything that looked incriminating. Lists of fights, payments, and even photos of dogs. Suddenly Max let out a low growl. Joe froze, his hand halfway to another stack of papers. What is it, boy? He whispered, stepping to the door. Footsteps echoed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Joe's heart raced. Evan, we've got company. Evan shoved the papers back into the drawer and locked it. Tastilly, we have to go, he said, his voice trembling. Joe nodded, leading the way out of the office. They moved quickly but quietly, weaving through the maze of crates. Max stayed close, his ears perked and his body tense. They neared the exit. A flashlight beams wept across the room, missing them by inches. Did you hearth? That a gruff voice called out, someone's here. Joe motioned for Evan to stay low as they crept toward the back door. The voices grew closer, their tones sharp with suspicion. Max growled again, his body low to the ground. Just as they reached the door, a shout rang. Out, hey, stop, Joe! And they bolted into the night, Max leading the way behind them. The sound of footsteps and angry voices filled the air. They sprinted across the lot, adrenaline pumping as they made their escape. By the time they reached the safety of Joe's truck, their breaths were ragged and their hearts raced. Did you get the pictures? Ivan skied, his voice shaking. Joe nodded, holding up his phone. We've got everything we need. As they drove back to the shop, Joe glanced in the rear-view mirror, half expecting to see headlights following them. The danger was far from over, but for the first time they had the upper hand. The evidence they gathered was enough to bring Alan's operation crashing down. The truck rattled over the uneven road as Joe and Evan sped away from the warehouse. The adrenaline of their escape still pulsed through their veins, leaving their breath shallow and their minds racing. Max lay sprawled across the back seat, his chest rising and falling steadily, his watchful eyes occasionally scanning the rear-view mirror as if he too sensed the gravity of the situation. Joe broke the silence first. You were brave back there, Evan, he said, his tone genuine. I couldn't have done it without you. Evan managed a faint smile, though his hands were still trembling. I just kept thinking about all the dogs Alan's hurt. If this can stop him, it's worth it. Joe nodded, gripping the stick, steering wheel tighter. It will stop him. We have enough evidence now to shut him down. As they neared the shop, Joe's phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was Rachel. Joe, did you get what you needed? She asked urgently. Joe replied, his voice steady despite his nerves. We've got photos of his records, enough to prove he's running an illegal operation. I'll send them to you as soon as I get back. Rachel sighed in relief. Good, I'll start working on a case file immediately. But Joe, you need to be careful. If Alan finds out what you've done, he won't hesitate to retaliate. Joe glanced at Evan, who was staring out the window, lost in thought. I know we'll lay low for now. After ending the call, Joe pulled into the shop's driveway and killed the engine. The quiet of the night enveloped them, a stark contrast to the chaos. Just escaped inside, Joe set up his laptop to upload the photos while Evan busied himself feeding Max. The dog wagged his tail enthusiastically, his demeanor a welcome reminder of their shared mission as the images transferred. Joe couldn't help but notice the tension in Evan's posture. Hey, he said gently, you did great tonight. Really? Evan shrugged, his expression guarded. I just hope it's enough, Alan. Alan, he's not the kind of guy who gives up easily. Joe placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. It's enough. And if he comes for us, we'll be ready that night. Sleep alluded. Joe. Every creak of the shop, every rustle of the wind outside felt like a warning. He couldn't shake the feeling that Alan was already planning his next move. Max, sensing Joe's unease, stayed close, his head on Joe's lapel. They sat in the dimly lit room the next morning. The evidence was delivered to Rachel, who immediately contacted the authorities. They're reviewing it now, she informed Joe. If all goes well, they'll raid Alan's operation within the week. The news was a relief, but it also brought new challenges. Joe knew that until Alan was in custody, they were still in danger. He decided to keep Evan at the shop for the time being, unwilling to risk the boy being found alone. As the days sped, a sense of camaraderie began to grow between Joe and Evan. They worked together to care for Max and maintained the shop, their shared purpose creating a bond stronger than either had anticipated. Joe learned more about Evan's past, this love for animals, his dreams of becoming a veterinarian before Alan's shadow fell over his life. You'd make a great vet, Joe said one evening as they cleaned the shop. You've got the heart for it. Evan smiled for the first time in days, a glimmer of hope lighting up his face. Maybe someday if we get through this, Joe nodded. We will, and when we do, you'll have a fresh start. Meanwhile, Max seemed to adopt Ivan as part of his pack, the dog who had once been we of strangers. Now followed Ivan around the shop, his tail wagging enthusiastically. Their bond was a testament to Max's resilience and a reminder of these chances they were all fighting for. One afternoon, while they were out back repairing a fence, a car pulled into the driveway. Joe tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward the wrench in his toolbox. But it was Rachel, her expression a mix of urgency and determination. The authorities are moving in tonight, she announced, stepping out of her cart. They've reviewed the evidence and secured a warrant. Alan's operation is going down. Joe exchanged a glance with Evan, who swallowed hard. Does he know Joe asked. Rachel hesitated. It's hard to say, but you need to be on high alert. If Alan suspects anything, he could lash out that evening as the sun dipped below the horizon. Double-checked the locks in the shop and kept Max close. Evan paced nervously, his energy restless. The tension was palpable, every shadow outside the windows. A potential threat. Hours later, Joe's phone buzzed with text from Rachel. The raid was a success. Alan's in custody. Joel, out of breath, he hadn't realized he was shouldering it over his head, showing Evan the message. The boy's shoulders slumped with relief, and for the first time in weeks, she smiled. Max barked softly, as if sensing the victory. Joe knelt beside him, scratching behind his ears. Witted it. Buddy, you're safe now. But as Joe looked out into the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that their journey wasn't entirely over. Alan might be behind bars, but the scars she'd left behind on Max and Evan, on countless others, would take time to heal, and Joe was determined to help them every step of the way. Their relief that followed Alan's arrest was short-lived. Thought the immediate danger seemed to have passed. The scars of his actions lingered. Joe had hoped that the arrest would mark the end of their ordeal, but the following days brought unexpected challenges that tested their resolve. News of Alan's capture spread quickly through the town, and while most celebrated the takedown of a notorious criminal, others weren't as pleased. Alan's associates, men who had benefited from his illegal operations, began to stir. Whispers of retaliation reached Joe, carried by concerned neighbors and clients who had overheard conversations in local bars an evening. While Joe and Evan were closing up the shop, a truck idled suspiciously at the end of the driveway. Its headlights cast long menacing shadows, and the rumble of its engine sent a chill through the air. Max, ever vigilant, stood at attention, owl growl rumbling from his throat. Joe stepped outside, his heart pounding. "Can I help you?" he called, his voice steady, despite the unease creeping into his chest. The truck's driver didn't respond immediately. Instead, the engine revved and the vehicle inched closer. Then, with a squill off tires, it sped off into the night, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. A van appeared at the door, his face pale. "Who was that?" he asked. Joe shook his head. "I don't know, but we need to be careful." The incident marked the beginning of a new wave of tension. Strange vehicles began appearing near the shop at odd hours, and Joe started noticing unfamiliar faces lingering around town. Thought the authorities had dismantled Alan's operation. It was clear that some remnants of his network were still active, and they weren't happy about losing their leader. Rachel, ever the voice of reason, advised Joe to report the incidents to the police. They need to know what's happening. She insisted, even if it's just intimidation, it's illegal. Joe followed her advice, but their response was less than reassuring. With Alan behind bars, the authorities believed the situation was under control. "Keep an eye out and let us know if anything serious happens," the officer said. It wasn't the assurance Joe had hoped for as the days turned into weeks. The tension took its toll on everyone. Evan's anxiety resurfaced, and he began avoiding going outside unless absolutely necessary. Max, sensing the unease in the household, became more protective, shadowing Joe and wherever they went. The night, the conflict reached its boiling point. Joe was awoken by Max's frantic barking. He bolted upright, his heart racing, as she grabbed a flashlight and headed for the back door. Evan appeared moments later, his eyes wide with fear. "What's going on?" hesked. Before Joe could answer, the sound of shattering glass echoed through the shop. Someone had thrown a brick through one of the windows, and the faint glow of fire flickered in its wake. "They're trying to burn us out." Joe realized, his stomach sinking. "Call 911, he ordered, Evan rushing to grab the fire extinguisher. Max was already at the broken window, barking fiercely at the figures retreating into the darkness. Joe let the flames quickly. The damage was done. The message was clear. When the authorities arrived, they found little evidence of the culprits. The incident was officially labeled as vandalism, but Joe knew it was more than that. It was a warning, a reminder that Alan's arrest hadn't erased the danger they faced. Evan was visibly shaken, and Joe struggled to comfort them. "We get through this, I promise," thought the words hollow. Max pressed against Evan's side, his presence offering a small measure of comfort. The following day, Rachel arrived with urgent news. "Alan's been talking," she said. Her expression grim. "He's trying to cut deal by naming names, but it's stirring up trouble. Some of the people he's implicating are dangerous." Joe felt a surge of frustrations. "So we're still not safe?" "Not yet," Rachel admitted, "but his testimony could take down the entire network. We just have to hold on a little longer." The knowledge that Alan's associates were being targeted by law enforcement brought some comfort, but it also increased the stakes. Joe knew more close calls, not with Evan's safety on the line. Determined to take control of the situation, Joe began fortifying the shop. He installed security cameras, reinforced the doors and windows, and kept a close eye on the surrounding area. Max remained ever watchful, his loyalty unwavering despite the precautions. Joe knew they couldn't live in fear forever. He began reaching out to the community, rallying support for stricter measures against animal cruelty and illegal activities. The story of Max's rescue and the fight against Alan's network resonated with many, sparking a wave of activism that brought a glimmer of hope. But the fight wasn't over yet as the days counted down to Alan's trial. Joe and Evan braced themselves for whatever might come next. They knew the road ahead would be difficult, but they also knew they weren't alone together with Max by their side. They prepared to face the final chapter of their journey as the trial date for Alan approached. The tension in Joe's life reached its peak. The quiet life he had built around his rescue shop seemed to hang by a thread, and every passing moment felt like the calm before an impending storm. Every day to stay focused on helping around the shop, but his frequent glances at the windows and doors betrayed his unease. Max, ever vigilant, seemed to share the same wariness, often growling at sounds on evening. Rachel called with an update that would change everything. "Joe, I just found out Ellen's associates are planning something big. They're desperate mold, and they might be targeting you to send a message." Joe's grip on the phone tightened. "Thou have any specifics when or how?" "Not yet," Rachel admitted, frustration lacing her voice, but it flagged it with her on alert. Joe hung up, his mind racing. This wasn't just about him anymore. Evan's safety and Max depended on his next move. He decided to act preemptively, fortifying the shop even further and briefing Evan on an emergency. "If anything happens," Joe said firmly, "you take Max and head to the shelter by the woods. It's hidden, and they won't find you there." Evan nodded, though his face prayed his fear. "What about you?" "I'll handle whatever comes." Joe replied, determination etched into his features. The next night, the confrontation finally came. Joe was awakened by the sound of car engines outside. He peered through the blinds to see 3 trucks pulling in the driveway, their headlights piercing the darkness. Shadows moved quickly. Several men stepped out, their intentions clear. Joe didn't wait. They grabbed his phone and called Rachel, speaking in a low, urgent tone. "They're here. I'm sending the police." Rachel replied, her voice as sharp with concern. "Donna, engaged them." Joe hung up and turned to Evan, who was already holding Max's leash. "Go," Joe urged. Now Evan hesitated for a fraction of a second, then bolted out the back door with Max, disappearing into the night. Joe locked the door behind the man, steeled himself for what? Wasto theme. Their footsteps crunching against the gravelone of them. A burly figure with a scar running down his cheek banged on the door. "We know you're in there." "Joe," he called out, "let us have a chat." Joe's heart pounded, but he forced himself to stay calm. "You're trespassing," he called back. "The police are on their way." The scarred man laughed, a loud, menacing sound. "Oh, we're not planning to stick around that long. Just thought we'd remind you what happens when you stick your nose where it doesn't belong." Before Joe could respond, one of them smashed a window with a crowbar, sending shards of glass scattering across the floor. Another began prying at their enforced door, testing its strength. Joe retreated deeper into the shop, his mind racing for a solution. Max, hiding with Evan in the shelter, growled softly as if sensing the danger his owner faced. Evan held onto him tightly, whispering, "Stay quiet." "Max, Joe's counting on us back at the shop." Joe made his snap decision. He grabbed a flare gun from his emergency supplies and fired it through the broken window. The bright light and deafening noise startled the intruders, buying Joe precious seconds. She grabbed his phone and dialed Rachel again. "They're breaking in," he said breathlessly. "How far of the police?" "They're close." Rachel assured him, "Just hold on a little longer." The intruders, regaining their composure, renewed their efforts. The scarred man kicked down the damaged doors, stepping inside with his near end of the line. But Joe wasn't alone. Max had broken free from Evan's hold and raced back to the shop, his instincts propelling him toward the danger. The dog burst through the side entrance, barking ferociously, his presence momentarily halting the men in their tracks. "Max, no!" Joe shouted, fearing for the dog's safety. But Max wasn't afraid. He lunged at the nearest intruder, his powerful frame knocking the man to the ground. The commotion distracted the others long enough for the sound of approaching sirens to fill the air. The scarred man cursed, signaling his crew, "Treat, this isn't over," has snarled, glaring at Joe before disappearing into the night. The police arrived moments later. Their flashing lights illuminating the chaos, officers quickly secured the area and began taking statements. Rachel arrived soon after, her face a mix of relief and anger. "You're lucky to be alive," she said, hugging Joe tightly. Joe glanced at Max, who was being checked over by an officer. "I owe him my life," he said softly. As the adrenaline faded, Joe realized the confrontation had only strengthened his resolve. Alan's associates might have been driven off for now, but their fight wasn't over with Rachel's help. Joe vowed to see the case through to its conclusion, ensuring that justice would be served not just for himself but for every victim of Alan's cruelty. The confrontation had left Joe rattled, but his resolve was unwavering. The attack on his shop wasn't just an attempt to intimidate, it was a declaration of war. As dawn broke over the quiet town, Joe knew the battle wasn't just about him anymore. It was about protecting everything Loved and standing up against the cycle of cruelty and fear that Alan's associates perpetuated. The police investigation began. Immediately, officers combed through the wreckage of the shop, collecting evidence and piecing together the events of the previous night. Joe provided every detail he could, and Rachel used her connections to escalate the case. "We have enough now to press charges against more members of Alan's networks," she said, determination. Lighting her eyes, "This time we'll finish what we started." But Joe wasn't content to wait passively for justice. He had learned through this ordeal that sometimes action was necessary to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Over the next few days, she threw himself into strengthening the shop's defenses, reaching out to the community for support and deepening his bond with Max, whose unwavering courage had saved his life. Max seemed to sense the shift in Joe's mindset. The dogs had owed it by scanning for any signs of danger. At night, he lay at the foot of Job, his ears twitching at the faintest sound. Evantu found solace in Max's presence, thought the attack had shaken him deeply. He began to draw strength from the dog's fearless loyalty. Then a breakthrough came. Rachel called with news that Alan had finally agreed to cooperate fully with law enforcement. In exchange for a reduced sentence, had provided critical information about his network, including the locations of safe houses and stashes of incriminating documents. "It's enough to take down the entire operation," Rachel said, her voice triumphant. Joe felt a surge of relief, but it was tempered by caution. "What about his associates, the ones who attacked us? They're on the run." Rachel admitted, "But with Alan's testimony, it's only a matter of time before we find them." That came sooner than expected. One evening, as Joe was locking up the shop, Rachel called again. "We've located them," she said. "A task force is moving in tonight." "It's over, Joe." Joe hung up his hearthy Abby with anticipation. He knew the raid would mark the end of this chapter. But the scars of the past weeks wouldn't fade easily. He looked down at Max, who wagged his tail in silent encouragement. "We did it, buddy," Joe said softly. "We made was swift and decisive." Law enforcement stormed the hide, arresting Alan's associates without incident. The operation dismantled the last remnants of the network, ensuring that none else would suffer under their cruelty. When Rachel called to share the news, Joe felt an overwhelming sense of closure. "It's really over," she said. "You're safe now." But Joe knew their victory wasn't just in their safety, it was in the lives they had saved, both human and animal, and the awareness they had raised in the weeks that followed. The town rallied around Joe and his shop, transforming it into a symbol of resilience and compassion. Donations poured in to help repair the damage, and volunteers offered their time to assist with the rescues. Ivantu began to heal with Max by his side. He found the courage to venture outside again, his fear replaced by a quiet determination. Together, they worked to expand the shop's reach, creating a sanctuary where no animal would ever face the horrors Max had endured on sunny afternoon. Joe and Evan stood outside the shop, watching as a group of children played with Max. In the yard, laughter filled the air, and for the first time in weeks, Joe felt a deep sense of peace. "We did it," he said, glancing at Evan. "We turned something terrible into something good." Ivan nodded, a small smile breaking across his face. "Max did it," he said. "He saved us." Joe looked at Max, who was now laying in the grass, his eyes half closed in contentment. The dog had been through so much, yet his spirit remained unbroken in that moment. Joe realized that Max wasn't just a survivor, he was a hero. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the yard in a warm golden glow, knelt beside Max and scratched behind his ears. "You're a good boy, Max," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The best." Max wagged his tail, his loyalty shining in his eyes. It was a quiet, unspoken bond, a promise that they would face whatever came next together. The weeks following the raid brought a sense of renewal and purpose to Joe's life. The scars from the confrontation were still fresh, but they served as a reminder of the strength he had found in himself and those around him. The community's unwavering support turned the shop into a beacon of hope, a place where second chances weren't just given, they were celebrated. The shop, now lovingly referred to as Max's Haven, became a local landmark. People from nearby towns and cities visited not only to adopt animals, but to hearth the incredible story of Max's bravery and resilience. Max, the once abused dog, had become a symbol of courage and loyalty, his story inspiring countless people to take a stand against animal cruelty. Joe's bond with Max deepened in ways she hadn't thought possible. Every morning, Max would accompany him on walks around the property, his tail wagging enthusiastically. The once anxious dog now exuded confidence and joy, his playful antics bringing a smile to everyone who visited. Ivan too found healing in Max's presence. The young boy who had once been too afraid to trust the world now worked tirelessly alongside Joe, caring for the animals and greeting visitors with a newfound sense of purpose. One afternoon, Rachel visited the shop, her smile reflecting the pride she felt in what they had accomplished. "You've turned this place into something incredible," she said, looking around at the bustling activity. Volunteers cleaned enclosures, children played with the animals, and a new family left with our rescued dog, their faces glowing with excitement. Joe nodded, his eyes following Max Asher through the yard with a group of children. It's all thanks to him. He said Max taught us what it means to fight for something worth saving. Rachel's expressions often you gave him that chance, Joe, and now look at all the lives she's touched. As they talked, a woman approached with her daughter holding a donation envelope. We heard Max's story, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. It gave us the courage to leave a bad situation. Thank you for what you're doing here. Joe accepted the envelope, humbled by the woman's words. It was moments like these that reminded him why he had started this journey, to create a safe haven for those who needed it most. Meanwhile, the impact of their efforts reached far beyond. The shop Allen's testimony had led to the dismantling of multiple animal trafficking. Rings, a new legislation was being proposed to strengthen protections against cruelty. Rachel, now a key advocate for these changes, often spoke about Max's story during public hearings, using it as a rallying cry for justice. But for Joe, the true reward was closer to home on a quiet evening. As the sun set over the town, he sat on the porch with Max at his feet and Evan by his side. The golden light bathed the yard in warmth, and Agent LeBreeze carried the laughter of children playing nearby. It was a moment of peace, a reminder that even in the face of darkness, light could prevail. Joe Evans' voice broke the silence. Yeah, do you think Max remembers everything, like how hard it was before? Joe looked down at Max, who gazed back at them with trusting eyes. I think he does, Joe said thoughtfully, but I also think he chooses to focus on what he has now. He's a survivor, Evan, and survivors don't forget they grow. Evan nodded, seeming to understand. He reached down to pat Max, who wagged his tail in response. I want to be like him. Evan said softly, strong, brave. Joe's mild, ruffling the boy's hair. You already area as night fell. Joe carried the memory of that day with him, a quiet affirmation that they were on the right path. The journey hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but together, with Max leading the way, they would face them. The next morning, Joe woke to find Max sitting by the door, his leash in his mouth. The dog's eyes sparkled with excitement, as if to say, what's next? Joe laughed, grabbing the leash and opening the door. Let's find out, buddy. And as they stepped into the fresh morning air, Joe felt a renewed sense of purpose. Max had been given a second chance, and in turn he had given Joe and everyone around the marathon to believe in the power of hope, resilience, and unconditional love. Did Max's story inspire you? How do you think animals show their love and loyalty? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you want to see more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the like button. Together, let's make the world a better place for animals and their humans. See you in the next video.